All right. Good noon, everybody, and we are back. Welcome to God Was Here, our study of the life of Christ as recorded in the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I know it's been some time since we last had a session, and it was a little bit longer than what I initially thought it was going to be, but as you can see, there have been a few changes in my life. So we got ourselves a brand new location, but we're still doing the same old study. If you don't recall what we were going over last time, that would be understandable. It's been a bit. We are still in one of these teaching sections within the life of Christ. If you remember, generally speaking, when you are talking about the life of Christ, you can deal with it splits into two sections, back and forth. Now, that's what is between the beginning of Christ's life, which actually encompasses the majority of the life of Christ, being the first almost 30 years of his life. And then the very end of it is dealing with the last week of his life. But most of the narrative is dealing with what happened during his ministry, which we usually think started about age 30. So we are still in one of those teaching sections that Matthew, Mark, and Luke like to skip in between. Teaching section, miracle or works section. Teaching section, work section. So we're at the end of one of the teaching sections. Last time we talked about what I call the Luke 12 sermon. I don't really know what else to call it. I've never heard it called by another name, but it is unique. There are a lot of elements within the Luke 12 sermon that happen in other places in the Bible, and bits and pieces of it get used in different spots according to the Bible writers, but it's not really repeated in that exact way in any other places, and there are some unique elements from it. So that's what we studied in last time. Now, the last thing we're going to look at is mostly going to be found within the book of Matthew. In fact, we're looking at Matthew chapter 16. You'll recall that we were pretty much all on the same page, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when we were dealing with the leaven of the Pharisees before. But it was the leaven of the Pharisees idea that sparked the Luke 12 sermon. Now we're looking at what comes after that in Matthew's account. So we're in Matthew chapter 16, and we're going to start with verse 13. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. This is often cited as the first time somebody had confessed that Jesus is the Christ. That just isn't true. We've seen that happen plenty of times already. We won't go back through all of them, but we should say that basically anybody who witnessed Jesus' baptism should have known that he was the Christ, because you have that voice coming from heaven, that's the Father, and looking down to Jesus says, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." So the concept that Jesus is the Christ, definitely not a new one, but this does appear to be a special one. Maybe it's just because it's the first time I think we've seen an apostle make that confession. But it does keep some of the other elements we see in other times people realized that Jesus is the Christ, such as Jesus strictly telling them not to tell anybody that he is the Christ. Now, why he chooses to do that, it's not always clear, but that is what he chooses to do. So, a few things we should mention about this. First of all, our Roman Catholic friends, they will definitely look to this scripture a lot. fact, I think I mentioned this previously, but it bears repeating. If you go to the Vatican today, you will see a symbol that is used to describe papal authority all of the time. And it's the symbol that includes a couple of crossed keys. And this is actually referencing this verse over here in Matthew chapter 16. Verse 18, I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And really, I think it's more towards verse 19, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So here's the idea. According to our Roman Catholic friends, this is where Peter first gains papal authority. Of course, they claim that Peter was the first pope. Now, it doesn't really work like that in practice. In fact, the papal authority over history has gotten stronger. We think of the Pope today, of course, as the vicar of Christ on earth, or at least that's a claim about him, and that he's the ultimate authority over the Catholic Church. But if you look in the history of it, that really wasn't always the case. It wasn't until several hundred years after the inception of the Church that you see what was at the time considered just the Bishop of Rome elevated to be the ultimate head over the Catholic Church. For the first several hundred years of their history, there was no greater rank within the Catholic Church than Archbishop. And there were 3 of them. In fact, there were 4 of them for a little bit before the Pope was elevated to a position of authority over all of them. You had an Archbishop, yes, in Rome, that became the Pope, but you also had an Archbishop in Alexandria. You had an Archbishop in Antioch. And then later, you have one in Constantinople. Now today, 2 of those historic sees still exist. I wouldn't be surprised to find out that there's still some sort of church in Alexandria with Catholic roots, or even possibly in Antioch. But really the ones that stick around are the ones in Constantinople and in Rome. The one in Rome calls himself Pope, which is from the Italian Il Papa, which just means father. And then if you go over to Constantinople, that is the traditional, not exactly head of the Orthodox Church. The phrasing is usually something along the lines of first among equals that you might see for the patriarch over there, but the term is patriarch, again, just meaning father. So, with that considered, you have the argument that here you have Peter gaining papal authority, and history doesn't really bear out on that one, because of course the claim is that later Peter in his life went over to Rome, and that's where he became the bishop of Rome. But again, there wasn't really much authority over the other sees that you see at this time. Further, it really is basically a misunderstanding of what Jesus is actually saying here. Here is what we need to focus on when he says, "On this rock I will build my church." Now, at first glance, someone might say, well, look at what the name Peter means, because of course before then, we've probably called him Peter a couple of times, but that's just because that's how he's better known. He was called Simon before this point. And look at what the word Peter means. It means rock. So Jesus is saying, upon you, I will build my church. And that's not really what it means at all. Peter is getting this nickname, Petros, because he has stumbled upon the rock. But Jesus is actually using a different word here. Just like in English we have different words to describe different types of rocks, you have different words to describe different types of rocks in Greek. Petros is where we get Peter, but if you're going to talk about a big stone, a boulder, you're probably more likely to use the word lithos. Again, you can see some of the similarities in English. Petros, if something's petrified, it is turned to stone. If you go to the petrified forest, that's a lot of fossilized wood. Lithos, again, if you hear somebody talking about the lithosphere, that's talking about rocks within the earth. So there is similarity here, but in Greek, Petros is pebble, essentially, and lithos, essentially, is boulder. Not the same word. Your version probably has the same word here, but there's a little bit of subtlety, and if we're going to get really, really accurate, it should probably say something closer to, along the lines of, I say to you that you are pebble, and on this boulder I will build my church. He's not talking about Peter. So what is he talking about? He's talking about the little thing that made Peter a rock in the first place. I gave him the pebble. Where do you get the pebble? You get the pebble as part of the boulder. And the boulder was the confession itself that Jesus is the Christ. The church is not built upon Peter. It is built upon the fact that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. If Jesus is not the Christ, if Jesus is not who he claimed to be, then anybody who claims to be a Christian is just wasting their time. There are some people who would claim to be Christians who might make the claim that Jesus actually wasn't the Christ at all. Rare, but they're out there. And they'll say instead that he was a good teacher. Well, that just doesn't work. All of Christianity is based upon the idea that Jesus is the Christ. That's the lithos. So what does he mean when he says, I will give to you the keys to the kingdom of heaven? Again, I think we talked about this a little bit before, and the cartoon version of this is, whenever you go up to heaven, before you get to the gates, you got to wait for Peter to read through your acts of what you've done in life. That's not really what it's talking about either. When we see that anything he binds will be bound in heaven, this is not a statement of authority, at least for Peter's part, but rather it is a reassurance about what he will be teaching. And we see that a lot with the apostles. They don't have to, you'll remember during the limited commission, Jesus told them, you don't have to worry about what you're going to speak at that moment. It will be revealed to you. So this is something that the apostles had. When Peter was speaking, yes, it had been bound in heaven, but he wasn't creating new laws. He was speaking from inspiration, is what is meant there. And none of this, by the way, is unique to Peter. So there you have the confession. Let's continue here. Verse 21. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your minds on the things of God, but on the things of man. When we look at Peter, the word that always seems to be around him, and the great descriptor of who Peter is the word impulsiveness. And Peter's impulsiveness tends to be responsible for his very best moments and his very worst moments, and we actually see that back to back in Matthew 16. Now, as the narrative comes, it makes it look like this happened almost immediately afterwards. Probably not. Probably wasn't on the exact same day that Peter in one moment is being called the Rock, right? And given this praise from Jesus, and then immediately turned around and now he's being called Satan. But we do see both sides of his impulsiveness. His impulsiveness in this first section, it caused him to boldly proclaim before any of the rest of the disciples, is that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. That was impulsiveness. But his impulsiveness a little bit later also made him say, Jesus, all the stuff you're saying about being killed, maybe dial back on that one. We'll help you out here. You don't have to worry about that, which of course, while we might understand Peter having a friendship with Jesus and not wanting to see him die, there is a certain amount of arrogance in thinking that he can correct the Lord when it comes to that sort of thing. Impulsiveness. That is what Peter tries to do here, and Jesus pretty strongly rebukes him. I don't recommend imitating the Lord exactly here, by the way, if somebody is unwittingly tempting you in the same way that Peter is unwittingly tempting Jesus. Jesus, we always have to remember one thing about Jesus. Jesus knows people's hearts better than we could ever possibly know. He knows other people better than we know ourselves. If you call somebody Satan, you're probably going to lose a relationship with them in most cases. We got to know that everything Jesus did, it was very, very well calculated. There's not a doubt that it was hurtful towards Peter, and I don't think Jesus did it to hurt him, but he allowed the hurtfulness to happen in order so that Peter might really, really repent from what's going on here. So he says, "Get behind me, Satan. For you've set your mind not on the things above, but on the things here." By the way, common problem for the apostles, and a common problem we even see today, is not recognizing what our goal is in Christianity. If you're in Christianity expecting to get some sort of physical blessing, physical treasure, man, you've missed the point entirely. And the apostles, you're not alone. The apostles missed that point pretty much through the entire life of Christ. And sometimes it's astounding. How on earth could they sit around in the Sermon on the Mount and hear Jesus say that you should not set your, or not build up your treasures for here on earth, where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal, but in treasures in heaven, and still think, okay, but, when's that physical earthly kingdom coming in? And yet, even today, we have people focused on the physical. You have the gospel of health and wealth. If you ever see a mega church or a televangelist with an extreme following, most of the time these people are proclaiming the gospel of health and wealth. If you follow Jesus, well, God's going to bless you back. Even if they're not that, there's a good chance they fall into a category we call premillennial dispensationalism. That's the idea that before the end of the world, there's going to be a 1,000-year physical reign of Christ on earth. What are we looking for there? We're looking for a physical kingdom still. One of the main points of the entire Old Testament, by the way, is that God giving us physical blessings as our reward for obedience does not work. It's the cycle that was repeated through the entirety of the Old Testament. He kept doing that, and what did it do? It didn't help his people. It made them evil every single time. And yet we're looking for the exact same thing today, and that's what the apostles are looking for. Later, they changed their attitude with that, but it takes some time for them to really realize that. We ought to be looking toward the spiritual, not the physical. All right. Dad commented as well, and he is agreeing with me. I always appreciate people agreeing with me. Thank you. Last thing I want to look in this chapter, beginning in verse 24. Then Jesus told his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." All right. Again, this is in response to what we saw from Peter before, the fact that he is clearly thinking about physical things. Jesus said, "Whoever would follow me, let him deny himself and take up his cross." You ever considered this, by the way, that when Jesus said this, he was probably the only one present who knew exactly how literally he meant take up his cross? If the disciples were extremely familiar with Old Testament scripture, there is enough within there to tell us about the manner of death in which Christ will die. But you kind of have to have a certain amount of astuteness, or somebody pointing out the fact that crucifixion matches everything that the Old Testament says about how the Christ will die. you'd have to be awfully wise in order to figure that out. And it's not that the apostles weren't wise by any means, but I have my doubts that they were that well informed about how Jesus was going to die. But I'm pretty sure Jesus knew precisely what was going to happen. So perhaps while the apostles are sitting around scratching their heads, why is Jesus bringing up the torture device? What does it mean when he said we should take up our crosses? For us, with the benefit of hindsight, the mental image that is produced, I mean, it's clear, right? We got to follow what Jesus did. He literally took up his cross. We need to take up our cross as well. Now, does that mean that each Christian ought to be crucified? Obviously not. It's talking, but Jesus tells us precisely what he's talking about: denying ourselves. Anyone who wishes to follow Jesus, it's time to deprioritize the things of this earth and prioritize spiritual things instead. And if that comes to something like being crucified, then we ought to go gladly to a torturous death, if that's what is required. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? For the Son of Man is coming with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. And here's a point I have to confess a little bit of confusion. Taking context out, it would appear that verse 27 is probably talking about the end of the world. But then verse 28 seems like it's talking about the establishment of the church. Well, why do I say that? Well, when we look at verse 28, he says, I say to you that there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Well, if you didn't know, most references to the kingdom of the Son of Man in the New Testament are referencing the church. There are some who say that all references to the kingdom in the New Testament are actually just talking about the church and none to heaven. I don't agree with that. I think there are times within the Bible where it is absolutely talking about heaven as the kingdom. It can get confusing, though, I admit. But then a little bit earlier, he says in verse 27, for the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of the Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. Now, when will each person be repaid according to what he has done? And the big thing to focus there is each. The fact that he doesn't seem to be speaking in any sort of figurative way, and the fact that he says each, would seem to indicate that he's talking about the end of the world. Now, you'll see similar language in Revelation, which I think is mostly not talking about the end of the world. But you definitely have clues within there to say this is not literal. I mean, to begin with, within the very first verse, the Apostle John, who is the writer of the book of Revelation, he tells us that these things are signs. Pretty good indicator we shouldn't take these things literally. That doesn't happen here. And so the word each, at what event will each person be repaid according to his deeds? The only event that makes sense to me is the end of the world. And so I mentioned there's a little confusion because here in verse 27, you have something that Jesus is saying, to me, seems to be pretty clear, talking about the end of the world. But then he says, I say to you that some of you will not taste death until the Son of Man returns, or until the coming of the Son of Man. Now, that could be talking about the church, but why does he suddenly change talking about the end of the world to the church? And of course, everybody who heard what Jesus said here, they've since died. Happened 2,000 years ago. Now, you might say that he's talking about spiritual death. And the fact that he doesn't say all of them will not taste death, well, that would be true, of course. Judas would die spiritual death before that point, and so it would be accurate that some of you will not taste spiritual death. But It seems to me like he's talking about physical death here. So this is a point where I have a little bit of confusion, and I got to tell you, I don't know exactly what's happening here. Jesus does that quite a lot. All right. Well, that is just about all the time that I have. I really appreciate your patience with of the gap between these, and we should be back on the regular here for the foreseeable future. And so until the next time I get to talk to you, I love you all, and I hope you have a wonderful day.